Hello and welcome to my lecture on different approaches to lesson structure. Today we focus on task-based approach. Alright, let's start from task-based learning background. As you remember recently, we focused on a traditional lesson structure model where we started a class from a warm-up activity, then we had presentation, practice, production and goodbye stage, as you remember. It was a very traditional lesson structure, and this traditional lesson structure has been harshly criticized. That's why a new approach that is also based on communication has been put forward. Its name is task-based learning. Of course, it's still within communicative approach. That means that in task-based learning, communication is still a great priority. And question for you is, where does task-based learning originate? Does it originate from Great Britain? This answer A. Or maybe from USA, or C, India, or D, Canada. Just take up some time. Yes, you're right. And you should circle the answer C. It comes from India. Task-based learning was developed by Dr. Prabhu in 1987. Actually, in 1987, he published his first book that was devoted totally to task-based learning. Dr. Prabhu was a teacher. He worked with different schools in Bangalore, in the South India. Of course, what you may see in the slide, it is not his real picture. Well, this is how I imagine Dr. Prabhu. I could not find his real picture in internet. But have a look what he actually claimed. In his book from 1987, he claimed that I speculated students were just as likely to learn language if they were thinking about a non-linguistic problem than if they were concentrating on particular language forms. In other words, we acquired the language not only in the situation, in a formal situation, when we focus on some specific forms, especially grammar, lexical forms, but we also acquired the language at any stage of our life when we focus on some non-linguistic problem, when we solve a problem related to our everyday life problems. All right, let's focus on the very term task. What does he mean by a term task? According to him, a task is a goal-oriented activity with a clear purpose in which learners use language to achieve a real outcome. So we cannot just assign any task to our students if there is no clear purpose that is behind the task, all right? If you think about, for instance, project work is a typical example of a task-based learning and task-based approach. So what happens in a project work? We have some particular purpose, all right? To give an example, our students are, designing an island, right? And they have to develop different characters that live on this island, different animals or species, all right? So they work in a group, they have some particular purpose, and of course they have to achieve some real outcome, all right, that is specified by a teacher. The question is it really within communicative approach? Of course. Task-based learning has much to do with communication. First, because it involves achieving some outcome, and number two, it focuses on creating a final product that can be appreciated by someone. So if you think about our activity within this project work, let's imagine a situation that our students are designing this island, that are actually drawing some outline of this island, they're drawing, animals and people who live on this island. So there is some final product. To give you more examples of different tasks, compiling a list of reasons. All right. I guess that you remember such activities that you had with your previous teachers, such as think about arguments for and against something, or if you were to spend 5 years on a desert island, what would be 5 things that you would take and justify your choice? So, right, this is something that is within this compiling a list of different reasons. Sometimes features or things that need to be done under particular circumstances. For instance, you compare 2 pictures, or you compare 2 different texts, or you solve a problem, right? I guess that you remember different activities such as, I don't know, there is a criminal story and your task as a learner is to guess who was actually the murderer, right? So this is a typical solving a problem activity that is within this task-based learning. Or designing a brochure, right? You may design a cover of a book, all right? So once again, apart from a clear purpose, there is also some final product, a book, right? Or a picture of an island, all right? Or finally you arrive at some final conclusion and you know who was the murderer. Now, let's try to define what is a real outcome. It's a little bit problematic. If you think about different course books, English course books, you may find in them lots of different activities. But these activities are not necessarily typical tasks, all right? Why is it so? Because in a typical task, we have some final product, we have some result. And have a look, a result of a task must be either seen or heard, all right? So if we have a result, students must produce something at the end of a lesson. It may be prepared by students in a written form or in an oral form. So it can be a summary, either spoken or written. It may be a project that I've discussed before, or some results of the final quiz on a crossword puzzle. And of course, there are many, many more examples. But it must be something that may be compared, that may be somehow evaluated by a teacher. And let's focus on a question. Is role play, for instance a dialogue, a real outcome? Can we treat it as a real outcome? Okay, I guess that your answer is no. At least it should be no. And for a number of reasons. Well, first of all, if we as learners, we are supposed to prepare some dialogue, most of the time the language and linguistic forms are imposed on us by the coursebook writers. So the teachers or the coursebook writers somehow suggest to learners that we should use present perfect tense or imperative, or contrast simple present and present continuous tense. So it's not actually real life situation, right? Because in a real life situation, no one imposes on you what structures you should use. So my conclusion is that definitely it's not real language that we use. Real language is our own language. That's why we cannot treat role play or a dialogue as a real outcome activity. And now a little bit of theory. This is a typical lesson structure in task-based learning. Have a look that we have actually 3 stages. We start from a pre-task, then we have task cycle, and finally we have language focus. Now I will try to focus on each of these stages, and we try to discuss them in details. Alright, let's start from pre-task phase in task-based learning. What does it mean that it's a pre-task? It means that before our students focus on a particular task, we as teachers, we first provide them with some introduction to a given topic or a task, all right? So if we come back to this idea with a desert island, all right, or dream island that that is designed by our students, we should, as teachers, give some guidelines to how they actually will be working in groups, in teams. What are the main objectives of this task? So in this phase, in this stage, we give our students clear instructions on what they will have to do at the task stage. Of course, we also might help the students to record some language that may be useful for the task. But mind you guys that we as teachers, we cannot impose any structures on our students. We may just give some hints, some prompts, all right? Give some suggestions that this particular vocabulary might be of much use for you. And then the pre-task stage can also often include playing a recording of people doing the task. So once again, it's just like giving some prompts, okay? You present to your students an example of a task. And of course, we as teachers, we are also allowed at pre-task stage to give our students a clear model of what will be expected of them. So if you conducted a similar project in some other groups of learners, you may present to your learners some final product, some final result, okay? So you may see actually, you may present the picture of this desert island. You may present some recordings that were presented by your students. And finally, students can take notes and spend some time preparing for the task. How much time? Of course, it depends on specificity of a given task and on the proficiency level of your students. Now let's focus on a task cycle. Let's start from a task. In a task, students may complete a task either in pairs or in groups using the language resources that they have as teachers. A teacher monitors and offers encouragement. Mind you that there is no task in which a student fulfills his task individually. There are always either pairs or groups. Then we have planning. At this sub-stage, students prepare a short oral or written report to tell the class what happened during their task. They can practice what they are going to say in their groups. Meanwhile, a teacher is available for the students to ask for advice, to clear up any language questions that the students may have. And finally, we have the report stage. This is the stage when students report back to the class orally, or they just read out the written report. This is a teacher who chooses the order of what students will present their reports and may give the students some quick feedback on the content. That means that if our students make mistakes at this report stage, we are allowed as teachers to give some corrective feedback. And we may also play a recording of others doing the same task for the students to compare. And finally, we have language focus. So after our students presented their final outcomes, their production, right? We as teachers, we need to focus on a particular linguistic form. So we analyze the productions of our students and we focus on these elements that were incorrect. So we highlight relevant parts from the text of the recording for the students to analyze. We may also focus on these items that were not incorrect, but they were for our students of some primary importance. So let's say that we focus on present perfect tense and we notice that this tense was extensively used by the students. So we may draw our students' attention to some particular present perfect forms by, for instance, putting these forms on the board. In this way, we ask our students to notice interesting features related to their project, their dialogues, role plays, or the text. And we highlight the language that the students use during the report phase for analysis. And finally, we have practice sub-stage within this language focus stage, in which teacher selects language areas to practice based upon the needs of the students. So if we notice that our students still have not mastered past participle forms in present perfect tense, we may focus on these specific items and practice them with the whole class. And the students then practice different activities to increase their confidence and make a note of useful language. So these items that seem to our students to be problematic are practiced once again. And now let's focus on some advantages and disadvantages of task-based learning. Let's start from positive points of this particular approach. I guess that you remember PPP, Pyramid Lesson Plan, in which we had this warm-up, presentation practice, and production stages. And in this traditional PPP model, the forms, the linguistic forms, were somehow imposed by on our students. In a task-based learning, students are free of language control. That means that when they are doing this project work, they are designing this, well, that dream island, they're allowed to use any linguistic structures, any linguistic forms that they know. Once again, we as teachers, we may give some suggestions, all right, but we cannot impose any forms on our students. In all three stages, they must use all their language resources. So they use all the vocabulary and all the grammar that they know. When we compare it with PPP, I guess that you remember that in this pyramid lesson plan, students were just practicing, but one pre-selected item that was imposed by the teacher. So in the pyramid lesson plan, if a topic of a lesson was passive voice, all the students had to use in dialogues and practice just passive voice. And another great advantage of task-based learning is a natural context, something that was not highlighted in the PPP lesson plan. This natural context is developed from the students' experiences with the language that is personalized and relevant to them. In the pyramid lesson plan, it was necessary to create context in which teacher presents the language. And as you remember, sometimes these contexts were very, very unnatural. So, for instance, there was a dialogue about a person talking to a, I don't know, stranger at a railway station. And even if you know that you are never actually traveling by train, but most of the time you travel by plane, all right, you had to use some particular linguistic forms in the context that does not appeal to your own person. Let's have a look at more advantages of task-based learning. More varied exposure to language. Definitely it's a great advantage of this approach. Students are exposed to a whole range of lexical phrases, collocations and patterns, as well as language forms. What is really interesting about task-based learning, it is the fact that when students are working over particular task, some project work, they are exposed to a variety of forms, not just from one student, but from a number of different students. So we may say that there is a kind of peer learning. You learn from your peers. And number two, the language explored arises from the student's needs. So in a particular situation, when there is a need to use particular linguistic form, you just use it, right? And this need dictates what will be covered in the lesson rather than a decision that is made by the teacher or the course book. So if we are talking about this project work and designing our dream island, our life on a dream island, some particular problems may just crop out during the very project. And we as learners, we may ask particular questions to our teachers related to the use of forms or the selection of some vocabulary. And number 3, it is a strong communicative approach where students spend a lot of time communicating. And of course, when we compare it with PPP lessons, task-based learning seems to be focused on the learner. So it's centered on the learner. When in the pyramid lesson plan, all the lessons they were focused on the figure of a teacher. And the last point is that it is enjoyable and motivating for our students. I guess that there is actually no point in discussing the last argument, the last advantage. That's obvious that the majority of learners, they like to prepare from time to time the project and in this way to practice their communication instead of covering, boring course book page by page, because it's something that is predictable, right? In task-based learning, everything is unpredictable, and it is something that is so appealing, right? Something that motivates our learners. And now let's focus on disadvantages of task-based learning. The first one is that students in a group, they talk in their native language. But this is actually what happens everywhere, I would say, right? Everywhere where there is the focus on communication and the teacher does not control the situation, there is such a danger that our students will try to use their native language, all right? That's why it's so important. It is so important for a teacher to come up from one group to another and to remind the students, do not speak Polish, right? Speak exclusively English. So this is the first danger related to task-based learning. Number 2, students have a choice of language, so they use simplified structures. What does it mean? Because we as teachers, we are not allowed in task-based learning to impose any particular forms on our students. Even if we want to practice present perfect tense, we are never sure whether our students will indeed practice these forms, or they will just simplify the language and they will use most of the time simple present tense, or instead passive voice, they will actually they will use active voice. So this is the second danger related to task-based learning implementation. And number 3, fossilization. That means that language stays at the same level. I guess that you remember the term of fossilization. It's related to second language acquisition. There is some point in our life when we are not able to acquire more language. It happens most of the time at a very advanced stages of your linguistic development. You've got this impression that you are not developing anymore, all right? So you are somehow fossilized. You stay at one level. Of course, it's bad, but it's not so bad as the process of backsliding, when actually you do not stop at one particular stage, but you keep on forgetting the material. So fossilization just refers to the situation when you stay at one particular level. You do not experience linguistic development anymore. And of course, if you, as a learner, you practice some language in a group, you work over some task, and you use very simplified structures, no wonder that sooner or later you might be fossilized. And then another disadvantage is unsystematic presentation of grammar. In a task-based learning, there is no presentation of grammar point, there is no practice production. As you remember, if there are some problems, alright, related to implementation of some task, the teacher just discusses these problematic items at the end of a lesson. That may be good for some learners, of course. But what about these, learners who are very systematic and they like the presentation of grammar that is, well structured? So it starts from explicit grammar explanation. That means that the teacher gives the rules, then they practice, they cover some exercises, and so on and so on. So definitely such a way of presentation of grammar is good, but only for the minority of the learners, but it does not work for the majority of the learners. And finally, the last disadvantage. Task-based learning is demanding for teachers. What does it mean? It's very time-consuming. You as a teacher, you have to prepare different resources at home, some paper, scissors, crayons, and so on and so on, right? So the very preparation of TB activities is time-consuming. Number two, monitoring students. It's not true that in task-based learning, it just students talking time and the teacher may just be, does nothing, all right? You have to be alert all the time and prepare the list with the errors. And after the presentation of the final product of the task, you as a teacher, you discuss the most common errors that were committed by your learners. And finally, you describe these errors and discuss them with your students. For these reasons, not many teachers actually decide for the implementation of task-based learning. Besides, I guess that if you prepare task-based activities for your students every lesson, or even every second lesson, that would be very, very boring. So task-based activities are really fun, they are motivating for our students, but on condition that you prepare them just on not regular basis, just from time to time. Alright, that was the theory related to task-based learning. And now let's focus on some practical examples. Let's imagine that a task that will be assigned to our students is related to the theme of planning a night out, in which you will use a listening exercise to provide specific language input. As to preparation materials, you will need to record 2 people planning a night out on the town. And right now, let's try to discuss all the stages of a task-based learning activities, starting from a pre-task. A pre-task activity should take about 15 up to 20 minutes. The main objective of this particular stage is to introduce the topic of nights out and to give the class exposure to language related to it. And at the same time, you highlight words and phrases related to spending the night out. To continue a pre-task stage, you as a teacher, you may show to your students some pictures of a night out in a restaurant, in a bar, in a pub, or ask your students where they go to have a good night out. Then you brainstorm some words and phrases onto the board related to the topic. That might be, of course, adjectives, verbs, nouns, some words related to feelings, emotions. You may introduce the listing of 2 people planning a night out. You may write up different alternatives on the board and to give them a reason for listening. For instance, in a restaurant, in a bar, or they meet at a train station or in the square. You play it a few times. First time to select from the alternatives, and the second time to note down some language. And of course, you tell your students that they are going to plan a class night out and give them a few minutes to think it over. After making all this introduction, you focus on the particular task. A task should occupy about 10 minutes up to 20 minutes. Of course, it depends on the structure of your lesson, right? On time allocation. Most of the time, if you prepare a task-based learning activity, it should take about 2 45-minute classes. So, a task, about 10 up to 20-minute task, in such a task, students do the task either in groups of 2 or in bigger groups, and they plan the night out. They match them with another pair to discuss their ideas, similarities and differences. Then there is some time for planning. Once again, about 10 minutes takes the planning stage. Each group or pair rehearses presenting their night out. Significant role of a teacher is highlighted at this particular stage. A teacher should monitor all the time what the students are talking about. So we as teachers, we should walk around and facilitate our students this planning activity. If there are any problems with the linguistic forms or with grammar tenses, we as teachers, we should help our students. And finally, we have the report stage that should take about 15 minutes. This is the stage when the whole class will be exposed to our final production, right? We may ask questions after the presentation, and we as teachers will give the feedback on the content, and we quickly review what was suggested. If you want to make this activity more interesting, you may ask your students to raise their hands and to vote for the best presentation, and your students may choose this group whose presentation was the best one. And now we are moving to language focus. As you may see, it should take about 20 minutes. In comparison with a task, the very task, it's very, very extensive. Why is it so? Well, actually, we expect that our students will make some errors, right? Or there will be some structures that students either use not correctly or they actually did not use. And we want to draw their attention to some forms that might have been used in this or in this particular situation. So, language focus, about 20 minutes, and at this stage, teachers should write on the board 5 good phrases used by the students during the task, and 5 incorrect phrases or sentences from the task, without the word that caused the problem. And our students discuss the meaning of these phrases, right, and how to complete the sentences. And some other ideas. You may hand out the text script from the listening and ask your students to underline the useful words and phrases. Or to give you some other ideas, you may focus on highlighting any language that we wish to draw attention to. For instance, language that was used by our students by making suggestions, collocations. Or students write down any other language that they wish to remember. So you ask the question to your students, what other phrases, what other collocations, what other linguistic forms would you like to know, and the forms that have been not discussed in your presentations. And before I say bye-bye to you, I prepared for you a kind of revision exercise. Have a look at this chart. You have PPP, that stands for Pyramid Lesson Plan, Right Presentation Practice Production, and TBL, that stands for Task-Based Learning. And your task is to use the following phrases that are on your left to fill in the table, the chart, right? And you should focus on these particular aspects, namely language use, what is the aim of these particular approaches, focus on language context and choice of language. All the phrases that you have on the left may be used in the chart just once. I wish you good luck. I guess that all of you filled in the chart in the correct way.